By the late 13th century, Scotland was a kingdom trembling on the edge of collapse. The death of King Alexander III and his young heir Margaret plunged the nation into a succession crisis. That vacuum at the top invited the attention of Edward I of England, Longshanks, a ruler whose ambition was matched only by his ruthlessness. To Edward, Scotland was not a sovereign nation with rights and traditions of its own. It was a wayward province that needed to be brought firmly under English rule. English domination quickly revealed its true nature. Heavy taxes were imposed, garrisons stationed across the land, and ordinary Scots endured humiliation at the hands of foreign soldiers. Villages were plundered, families torn apart, and the daily indignities of life under occupation became unbearable. Beneath the surface, resentment smoldered, waiting for a leader to ignite it into open flame. That leader was William Wallace. He was not a nobleman with wealth or armies at his command, nor was he a political figure maneuvering for power. Wallace came from the minor gentry, an unremarkable background in a land where birth often determined destiny, but personal loss under English oppression hardened him. Legends tell of his family suffering violence at English hands, transforming Wallace from a local landowner into a man consumed with vengeance and a vision for freedom. In 1297, Wallace's fury erupted onto the battlefield at Stirling Bridge. With limited numbers and modest resources, he orchestrated a stunning victory. Using the narrow bridge as a trap, he turned the pride of English heavy cavalry into their downfall. What unfolded was not just a tactical success, but a seismic shock. The realization that the seemingly invincible English war machine could be broken by Scots armed with little more than courage, cunning, and steel. That victory electrified the nation. For the first time in years, the people of Scotland saw independence as more than a wistful dream. Wallace was proclaimed Guardian of Scotland, a title that carried both honor and crushing responsibility. Yet the true weight of his legacy lay not in titles, but in symbolism. Wallace embodied the hope of an entire people. He proved that resistance was possible, that dignity could be defended, and that one man's defiance could inspire thousands. Amid a Scotland divided, its nobles wavering, many choosing submission, Wallace's rise was like thunder rolling across darkened skies. He was not crowned by bloodline or papal blessing, but by the trust of common men and women. That made him dangerous, not only to Edward I's iron grip, but also to the Scottish aristocracy content with compromise. From the moment Wallace's banner was raised, Longshanks understood that this figure, forged from the fury of ordinary Scots, would have to be destroyed completely, body, spirit, and memory, if English supremacy was to endure. Edward I of England, better known as Longshanks, was a monarch who built his reign on iron discipline and relentless expansion. Towering in stature and feared by his enemies, he had already carved his reputation as a ruthless conqueror. He crushed the Welsh with brutal efficiency, raising massive stone castles to secure their submission, and expelled the Jews from England in a sweeping act of intolerance. For Edward, rebellion was not a problem to be negotiated. It was a fire to be extinguished completely, lest it spread. Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge in 1297 was therefore an insult that Edward could not forgive. It challenged his authority, mocked the strength of his armies, and emboldened a people he considered little more than unruly subjects. If such defiance were allowed to stand, the very fabric of his rule would unravel. Wallace had to be defeated, not just on the battlefield, but in the imagination of both Scots and English. 2 years later, at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, Edward struck back with the full weight of his military might. The English longbow, deadly in the hands of trained archers, ripped apart the Scottish formations. Wallace's army was crushed, and though he escaped the slaughter, his aura of invincibility was shattered. He resigned as Guardian of Scotland, but his fight was far from over. Now reduced to a fugitive leader, Wallace turned to guerrilla tactics, striking where he could, keeping the flame of resistance alive. To Edward, however, Even a fugitive Wallace was intolerable. The king knew that symbols were as dangerous as armies. As long as Wallace roamed free, Scotland's submission would remain uncertain. More dangerously still, Wallace's defiance embarrassed the Scottish nobility who had bent the knee to England. His existence exposed their compromises and cowardice, reminding common Scots that true resistance was still possible. Determined to erase this thorn in his side, Edward placed a bounty on Wallace's head and unleashed a network of spies, informants, and collaborators across Scotland. The hunt became systematic. Villages were pressured, families interrogated, and allies tempted with promises of wealth or pardons. Gradually, the circle around Wallace grew smaller. Former friends turned wary, and some turned traitor. For men living under English domination, association with Wallace became synonymous with a death sentence. Edward's obsession was clear. He would not rest until Wallace was paraded as a captured rebel, stripped of all dignity, and destroyed in a manner so horrifying that no Scot would dare to follow his path again. In Longshanks's mind, this was not just punishment. It was policy. To extinguish rebellion, one must extinguish its spark. And in the summer of 1305, that spark was William Wallace. By 1305, William Wallace had become less a commander of armies and more a hunted figure, a fugitive slipping through forests and villages, sustained only by the loyalty of a dwindling band of followers. His name still carried power, but his means of resistance were growing fragile. For Edward I, the moment had come to tighten the net. The betrayal, when it came, was as bitter as it was inevitable. Wallace was not seized by English soldiers in battle, but delivered into their hands by fellow Scots. Sir John Menteith, a knight who had already submitted to English rule, is most often named as the traitor. Whether driven by ambition, fear, or simple survival, he arranged Wallace's capture near Glasgow in August 1305. For the man who symbolized defiance itself, the fall into enemy hands was the cruelest twist of fate. News of Wallace's capture swept through Scotland and England with electric speed. In London, it was greeted as a triumph, proof that Edward's long pursuit had finally succeeded. But for Edward himself, this was only the beginning. Wallace alive was more useful than Wallace dead. His capture would not end the story. It would provide the prelude to a public destruction staged for maximum humiliation. The journey south was carefully orchestrated. Shackled and bound, Wallace was paraded through towns and villages along the route, displayed like a trophy for English subjects to gawk at. Crowds gathered, jeering, throwing insults and refuse. The once mighty guardian of Scotland was reduced to a spectacle, dragged in chains as though he were a common criminal. Every mile traveled was a calculated act of psychological warfare, designed to strip Wallace of dignity long before the scaffold claimed his body. For Wallace, the ordeal must have been a test of unbreakable spirit. Contemporary accounts suggest he bore the journey in silence, his face fixed with a grim resolve. He had endured defeat before, but this paraded through hostile streets, his identity twisted into that of traitor and outlaw, was a different kind of battle. It was a fight not against swords, but against humiliation. By the time Wallace reached London, the stage had been set. His entry into the capital was a grotesque parade, the streets crowded with citizens eager to catch a glimpse of the notorious rebel. To the English crown, his arrival was the crowning jewel of a decade-long campaign. For the Scots who still held him in their hearts, it marked the prelude to tragedy. On the 23rd of August, 1305, the walls of Westminster Hall echoed with anticipation. William Wallace, the man who had defied the English crown for nearly a decade, stood chained before a court that had already decided his fate. The trial was a performance, not a pursuit of justice. Conducted in Latin, a language Wallace likely did not understand, the proceedings were less about law and more about spectacle. The charges leveled against him were sweeping: treason, murder, sacrilege, arson, rebellion against the rightful king. The irony was glaring. Wallace was accused of treason against a monarch he had never sworn loyalty to. When given the chance to speak, he declared that he could not be guilty of treason, for he had never been Edward's subject. It was a bold statement of defiance, a final affirmation of Scotland's independence in the face of English dominance. Yet his words fell into silence. The court's purpose was not to weigh truth, but to justify punishment. The sentence was delivered with ritualistic gravity. Wallace was to be drawn through the streets of London, hanged until near death, cut down while still alive, disemboweled. His entrails burned before his eyes, then beheaded and quartered. Each stage carried symbolic weight. To be drawn meant degradation. To be hanged meant rejection by heaven. To be disemboweled meant corruption of the spirit. And to be quartered meant total annihilation. This was not merely execution. It was annihilation, crafted into theater. The morning of the execution dawned bright and clear. Crowds poured into London, eager to witness the spectacle that had been advertised like a festival. Vendors sold food and drink. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders. The execution of William Wallace was not framed as tragedy but as entertainment. From the Tower, Wallace was bound to a wooden hurdle and dragged through the city's busiest streets. Cobblestones tore into his flesh as the horses pulled him along, jeering crowds, spitting, shouting, hurling refuse. To many, he was a traitor receiving justice. To others, his silent endurance turned humiliation into a form of quiet resistance. Accounts describe him staring ahead, unflinching, as though already looking beyond the mortal world. At Smithfield, the scaffold awaited. Wallace was stripped and hoisted by the neck, but the rope was positioned not to break his neck, but to choke him slowly. His body convulsed, his face turned purple, and just before unconsciousness claimed him, the rope was cut. He collapsed to the platform, still alive, gasping for air. Then came the horror most feared. The executioner opened Wallace's abdomen, pulling out his intestines while he screamed in agony. Each organ was displayed to the roaring crowd before being cast into the fire. Symbolically, his compassion and humanity were burned away, leaving only pain and defiance. The stench of burning flesh mingled with the cries of the multitude. Even then, Wallace endured. Some witnesses claimed his eyes never closed, that he faced his tormentors with unbroken resolve until at last the axe descended. His head was severed in a single stroke. The silence that followed was brief. The crowd roared as the executioner lifted Wallace's head high, blood still dripping, the symbol of defiance extinguished. But his ordeal was not complete. His body was quartered, each piece displayed as though butcher's meat. One quarter went to Newcastle, another to Berwick, another to Stirling, and another to Perth. His head, tarred to preserve it, was set upon London Bridge, staring down at the Thames for years, a warning to all who dreamed of rebellion. To Edward, this was the perfect conclusion. A rebel humiliated, a movement destroyed, a nation cowed, but history would see it differently. Wallace's death was remembered not as a deterrent, but as a martyrdom. The brutality of his execution exposed the cruelty of English power and transformed a man into a legend. His body was scattered, but his memory could not be dismembered. In the immediate aftermath of William Wallace's execution, Edward I seemed to have achieved his goal. The gruesome spectacle shocked Scotland into temporary submission. Many of Wallace's supporters fled or swore allegiance to the English crown, convinced that no cause was worth such a horrific fate. To Edward, the rebel had been destroyed, body and spirit alike. Yet history rarely obeys the plans of kings. The very brutality of Wallace's death ensured that he would not be forgotten. What Edward intended as a warning instead became a rallying cry. Far from extinguishing resistance, the execution planted seeds of defiance that would grow for generations. In Scotland, Wallace's martyrdom took root almost immediately. His courage in facing torture without begging for mercy was retold in taverns and households, transforming a military defeat into a moral victory. Ballads and chronicles painted him as a figure larger than life, a man who embodied the nation's will to be free. His memory passed from soldier to child, becoming part of Scotland's cultural fabric. For Robert the Bruce, Wallace's fate carried a personal weight. Bruce had wavered between allegiance to Edward and loyalty to Scotland, but the image of Wallace's suffering sharpened the choice. Within a few years, Bruce would take up the banner of independence, leading Scotland to eventual triumph at Bannockburn in 1314. In this sense, Wallace's death was not an ending, but a beginning. Beyond Scotland, Wallace's execution resonated as well. Foreign envoys who witnessed or heard of the spectacle carried tales back to Europe. The image of England, powerful but cruel, was reinforced in the courts of France, Flanders, and beyond. Edward had intended to project dominance. Instead, he also projected brutality. Diplomacy would forever bear the shadow of Wallace's scaffold. Over the centuries, Wallace's story only grew. Medieval poets turned him into a symbol of knightly virtue, while later writers in the Renaissance and Enlightenment celebrated him as a champion of liberty. By the 19th century, in the age of romantic nationalism, Wallace had become Scotland's national hero. Monuments rose, songs were sung, and his name was invoked in every debate about freedom and identity. In the modern age, Wallace's legacy crossed into global culture. His story inspired novels, paintings, and films, most famously Braveheart, which, though romanticized, carried his defiance to audiences far beyond Scotland. The core truth remained the same. One man's refusal to bow became a universal symbol of resistance. Wallace's execution also left a mark on legal and moral thought. Scholars cited it as an example of judicial cruelty, a case study in how power can distort justice. Out of such excesses, the idea of fundamental human rights slowly emerged, the notion that even enemies deserve dignity in life and death. In this way, Wallace's suffering contributed to the slow shaping of modern concepts of justice. Today, the legend of William Wallace continues to endure. His body may have been scattered across the kingdom, but his spirit has never been quartered. He reminds us that freedom is never free, that it demands sacrifice, and that sometimes the most powerful victories are not those won on battlefields, but those etched in memory by the courage to endure. Wallace's blood soaked into London's cobblestones more than 7 centuries ago, yet his defiance still echoes. His story asks every generation the same question: what principles are worth suffering for, and what price will we pay for liberty? In the silence after his final cry, the answer resounds: still freedom endures.